Welcome to a moment of meditation. I am Patricia Lee, the assistant chaplain here at the village. You are most likely familiar with the 12 days of Christmas. According to the traditional church calendar, 12 days from Christmas Day would be January 6th, a day called the Epiphany, which means appearance or manifestation. Epiphany commemorates the wise men following the star as a revelation from God to lead them to the King of the Jews. The event surrounding the birth of Jesus up to that point was full of joy and glory and hope. But the visit of the wise men brought on a most horrible and tragic event in Bethlehem. To begin our meditation on that event, we will read the words of the Old Testament prophet Isaiah in chapter 49, from verse 13 to 15. Sing for joy, O heavens, and exult, O earth. Break forth, O mountains, into singing. For the Lord has comforted his people and will have compassion on his afflicted. But Zion said, the Lord has forsaken me. My Lord has forgotten me. Can a woman forget her nursing child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her wombs? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. This short passage appears to depict several contradicting situations and emotions. It opens with exuberant singing, with joy and hope. The reason? God has comforted his people. But right away, Zion responding that God has forgotten and forsaken her. Now Zion is another name for Jerusalem, which represents God's people. While the people were supposed to be hopeful and joyful, the reality of their experience made them feel that they had been abandoned by God. When trials and tribulation hit, such as during the present pandemic, or when we are suffering sickness or loss, we might identify with Zion's lament. But right away, God reminds us, surely no mother can forget her young child. But even if a mother can forget, God promises that he will not forget his people. With that opening passage in mind, let us read today's story from Matthew chapter 2, verses 16 to 18. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem, in all that region, who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. You may remember when the wise men were looking for the newborn king, they first went to Jerusalem to inquire of the whereabouts of this king of the Jews. When King Herod heard about it, he was greatly alarmed, fearful for losing his power and authority. After the chief priests and scribes pointed the wise men to Bethlehem, according to the prophecy from Old Testament, Herod instructed the wise men to report to him the whereabouts of this new king after their visit, so that he could get rid of him. But God warned the wise men in a dream not to return to Herod, so they returned to their own country by a different way. King Herod waited and heard nothing. He became furious, but he was determined to eliminate this threat to his throne. So what did he do? He ordered the killing of all the young boys in Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under. I admit I lack imagination. The horror did not hit deep in me until I looked up paintings by artists of the massacre. They show mighty soldiers snatching the toddlers from the arms of the mothers, even piercing them with long spears. When you see the image, you can hear the wailing of the mothers, the screaming of the children, and the fear and chaos in the air. Then my imagination returns. I began to see the refugee women at the border when their children were forcibly snatched from them. I could hear the wailing of the parents in Nigeria when their children, hundreds of them, were kidnapped from their boarding school. There were people, mostly women and children, caught between ISIS and the regime in Syria, and the conflict rages on. I could feel the unspeakable horror and anguish when a mother was forced by the Nazi soldier to choose between two of her children, keeping one and abandoning the other. There were genocides even in this land. Violence and killings and evil go on throughout history. I found myself in Bethlehem. There was no warning for these families, these mothers. There was no way, no time to escape. Separation and death descended upon them in an instant. Where was God? Wasn't he supposed to protect their children, to spare them from such horror, such pain? Surely they did not deserve this, especially the children. They were innocent. The Apostle Matthew added this commentary after he recounted the story. He quoted the Old Testament Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. I will read from Jeremiah. Thus says the Lord, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Rachel was a favorite wife of Jacob. For a long time she was barren, while her sister Leah and the two concubines of Jacob bore 10 children. Finally, God gave her a son, Joseph, then another one. But she suffered a hard labor and died after naming her baby boy Benoni, son of my sorrow. But Jacob called him Benjamin. In Genesis chapter 35, we read that she was buried on the way to Bethlehem. That was history. Prophecy works differently. It may allude to a facet of history, but the purpose is to point to an event in the future. And often it may point to more than one event. When Jeremiah was writing, the immediate event is the Babylonian captivity in which the people of Judah were exiled to Babylon. God was offering hope to the exiled. We read that in verses 16 and 17 by Jeremiah. Thus says the Lord, keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your work, declares the Lord, and they shall come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, declares the Lord, and your children shall come back to their own country. Jeremiah's prophecy was fulfilled 70 years later when the exiles returned to Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple and the city. But what about the baby boys that were slaughtered by Herod and their mothers who grieved for them? Let's first take a detour to read about the boy Jesus and his parents before returning to the atrocity of this massacre. I will read from Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 to 15. Now when they, that's the wise men, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I call my son. So God preserved the life of his son by instructing Joseph to take him and his mother Mary to flee to Egypt. By now, Joseph had gotten accustomed to receiving instruction from God directly through dreams. He believed God fully and never questioned, but faithfully obeyed. So the life of boy Jesus, the Son of God, was preserved. And Matthew records what happened to the little family now in Egypt. We'll read from verses 19 to 23 of the same chapter. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, "Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when we heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, that what was spoken by the prophet might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. The Apostle Matthew, who wrote the Gospel, was inspired to point us time and time again to see how the life of Jesus, even his conception, his birth, his infancy, and now into his childhood, has been prophesied in the Old Testament. There is no doubt that this Jesus is a long-awaited Messiah of God's people. Now back to the babies killed under Herod's cruel edict. Basically, in place of the boy Jesus, whom Herod was aiming to eliminate. They had become the first martyrs to die for Christ's sake, even without their knowing or consent. The ancient church had a tradition of observing the Feast of the Holy Innocents in commemorating this event. How are we to understand why God would allow such atrocity to happen? I don't think there's a satisfying answer to the why question pertaining to God. But there's a clear answer from the human angle. It came about because of the evil in King Herod. We see that time and time again in crimes against people, even against humanity, perpetrated by evil people, even today. How long, O Lord? But this is what I have observed and discovered from experience. When we are afflicted, when tragedy comes into our lives, we lose sight of the big story. There is wisdom in admitting that some wounds may not be healed in a human lifetime. That is wisdom for us to remember when we are afflicted, and for us to know when we minister to the brokenhearted. But our moment of grief and loss is not eternity. Our story is not the whole story. As God has spoken through Jeremiah, there is hope for your future, and your children shall come back to their own country. Rachel's grief was inconsolable at the time, but eventually God, who is faithful, will comfort his people, as Isaiah has reminded us. And it is especially poignant that Jesus had declared, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." We may not know when or how, but by faith we believe, and God will not forsake or forget his children. There is one Christmas carol that is not joyful, but instead haunting and mournful. It is this one commonly called the Coventry Carol, a lullaby called "Lulay, Thou Little Tiny Child," that depicts the mothers who anticipate the grief of his horrendous event. Let's sing together with Dan Stokes leading.
Bye bye, Luli, Lule. Oh, sisters too, how may we do for to preserve this day, this poor youngling for whom we sing. Bye bye, Luli, Lule. Herod the king in his raging charged he hath this day his man of might in his own sight, all children young to slay. Then woe is me, poor child, for thee, and ever mourn and say, for thy parting, nor say, nor sing. Bye bye, Luli, Lule.
The benediction is adapted from the Song of Zechariah, the father of John the Baptizer, in Luke chapter 1, verses 78 to 79. Receive the benediction. May the tender compassion of our God break upon you and shine on those who dwell in darkness and the shadow of death, and guide your feet into the way of peace. Thanks be to God.